A courtroom, just another day or so it seems. But when a power-hungry cop decides to assert control the wrong way and lays hands on a calm black woman seated in silence, he thinks he's making a statement. What he doesn't know is she's not just a witness, she's the new judge. And what happens next is a quiet storm of dignity, exposure, and justice that shakes the entire system from the inside out. This is not a story about rage, it's about resolve. And trust me, you won't believe how it ends. So sit back, settle in, tell us what time you're watching and where you're tuning in from. Drop a comment below, we'd love to hear from you. It was supposed to be an ordinary Tuesday in Savannah, gray sky, a gentle mist softening the courthouse steps, the kind of morning where people kept their heads low, coffee in hand, minds already lost in meetings and legal motions. The courthouse doors swung open rhythmically with the comings and goings of attorneys, clients, and weary clerks, each absorbed in their own little orbit. Somewhere inside those walls, paper shuffled like distant rainfall, and security radios clicked softly like a second heartbeat pulsing beneath the walls. No one noticed the woman in the navy trench coat at first, tall, poised her stride, unhurried but deliberate, as if she belonged and didn't need to prove it. Her name was Althea Monroe, and what most didn't know, not yet anyway, was that in 5 days she would be the one presiding over this very courtroom. She walked past the security checkpoint with a quiet nod to the guards, none of whom recognized her face, and that suited her just fine. She wasn't here for attention or ceremony, not today. She was here to watch, to listen, to feel the pulse of the place before she ever took the bench. It was a habit she'd developed early in her career, not stepping into power cold, but letting the space speak first. And this courtroom, Courtroom 3B, had stories buried in its floor tiles and benches, in the tired eyes of defendants and the tight fists of overworked public defenders. Althea settled into a seat near the back, placed her briefcase on the floor, and folded her hands in her lap, letting her breath slow her attention widen. The bailiff called the room to order, and people stood out of instinct. The presiding judge, an aging man with a clipped voice and a tendency to sigh between sentences, took the bench and began the roll of morning cases. A father fighting for visitation, a teenager caught with weed, a landlord demanding back rent from a single mother holding a baby that wouldn't stop crying. No theatrics, just life filtered through the dry mechanics of legal process. But Althea wasn't watching the judge. She was watching the room. The way the deputy by the wall kept shifting his weight. The way a young woman's jaw clenched every time she was spoken to. The way Officer Mallory, seated near the jury box with his arms crossed and badge gleaming, smirked when certain names were read out loud. She'd read the name Frank Mallory before, in complaints that never saw daylight, in whispers that never made it to the formal record. White officer, 18 years on the force, a reputation for being strict which was often code for something uglier. She watched as he leaned over and muttered something to the bailiff, both of them laughing under their breath. She couldn't hear the words, but she didn't need to. Some things weren't about sound. They were about posture tone, the way a man could occupy space like he owned it. Althea shifted slightly in her seat, her spine straight but relaxed, her expression unreadable. She wasn't here to be provoked. She was here to see what happened when no one thought she mattered. Outside, the mist had thickened, softening the city's edges, and inside the fluorescent lights hummed with the low, tired rhythm of bureaucracy. A woman 2 rows ahead whispered to her daughter to keep still. A public defender rifled through a folder with nervous fingers, and yet even amid the repetition of minor cases and muted lives, there was something gathering in the air, like static, like weather. Althea felt it in the tightness between her shoulders, in the flicker of eyes, watching her from the side without knowing why. When the judge called for a 10-minute recess, the room exhaled. Shoes scuffed linoleum. Doors opened. People stretched, stepped out, whispered into phones. But Althea remained seated. Mallory stood and walked slowly across the courtroom floor. He wasn't heading anywhere in particular, just taking his time, scanning the room. Then his gaze landed on her. He paused. 1 beat, 2. His head tilted slightly, the kind of tilt that asked, "Who are you, and why are you in my space?" She met his gaze, held it, then looked away without flinching. No challenge, no retreat, just refusal to be intimidated. And that somehow was worse for men like him. He turned sharply, walked past her row, then stopped just behind her shoulder. "You're in a restricted seat," he said, low and firm. Not loud enough for the whole room, but loud enough for her. Althea looked up at him slowly, her voice even. "I don't believe it is." "It is now," he replied, folding his arms, staring down at her with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. She held his stare for a long moment, not moving. "Do you treat everyone like this, or just women who look like me?" His smile twitched. The silence between them crackled. A young man nearby shifted uncomfortably. Someone else looked away. No one said a word. After a beat, Althea stood not because he told her to, but because she chose to. She didn't grab her briefcase. She didn't say another word. She simply stepped 2 seats to the left and sat back down. Mallory stood for another moment, as if expecting something more. An apology, a retreat, maybe a sign of fear. But there was none. Just the soft rustle of her coat as she smoothed it over her knees, and stared forward again as if he no longer existed. For a few seconds, the air in the courtroom held still. The mist outside had crept up the windows, now turning everything gray and blurred. Inside, the lights kept humming. The judge returned. Court resumed. Mallory walked away, his jaw tight, his shoulders stiff. And Althea Monroe, still silent, still watching, knew exactly what kind of man she was dealing with, and knew deep down that this wasn't the end of it. It never was. Most mornings in that courthouse drifted by in a rhythm. Everyone silently agreed not to disturb. Paper shuffled bailiffs, barked half-hearted instructions, and attorneys whispered strategies that barely carried past the wood-paneled pews. But this morning something was off, and Althea could feel it the way a person senses a change in pressure before a storm breaks. The light coming through the narrow windows was thin and tired, as if the sun had decided to withhold its full warmth, and even the usual buzz of hallway chatter felt muted, strained like tension hanging in the corners of the room. Althea sat still, her body aligned with a practiced calm, but her breath had slowed, narrowed the way it always did when a situation required more watching than reacting. She didn't notice Mallory at first, not because he wasn't visible, but because she had trained herself not to focus on noise until the noise focused on her. He had that kind of presence, loud in a quiet way, like a dog pacing behind a fence you're not sure is locked. She glanced his way only when she felt the weight of his stare settle on her like an unwanted coat. He was leaned against the wall, arms crossed, thumb tucked under his belt, eyes scanning the room like he was looking for something wrong and daring someone to give it to him. When their eyes met, he didn't look away. He tilted his head slightly, gave the faintest twitch of a smile, then returned his gaze to the front, as if he'd made a decision no one else had heard him speak. Althea turned back to the hearing, but the air around her had changed. The quiet hum of voices seemed to recede, and in its place came the low, anticipatory silence of something about to happen. Not a scream or a fight, but that sharper, subtler kind of danger, the kind that comes when someone with power decides to use it not to protect, but to remind you they can. The presiding judge was discussing terms with an attorney over a property settlement. Althea barely heard a word. Her thoughts narrowed to the space behind her, the sense of proximity that only deepened with each minute Mallory lingered in place. It was the way predators hovered, not lunging, not announcing themselves, just existing close enough to make you question your own instincts. 10 minutes later, the courtroom shifted again. A woman stood to exit. A man reached for a file. Althea shifted slightly in her seat, pulling her coat tighter. That was when he moved. No sound announced it, but she felt the shift in the air and turned just as Officer Mallory stepped beside her row, stopping right at her shoulder. His voice, when it came, was soft enough not to draw attention, but hard enough to demand obedience. "That seat's for legal representatives only," he said. Without looking at her, his tone edged with authority, the kind that didn't expect to be questioned. Althea didn't move. "I'm not disrupting anything," she said evenly, her eyes still on the bench. "There are no signs indicating restrictions." "Didn't ask for a debate," he muttered. "Stand up and move." The words weren't loud, but they rang like steel dropped on concrete. Several heads turned subtly. No one spoke. No one interfered. And that more than anything was what tightened the knot inside her chest. She turned her head toward him, her voice measured, quiet but firm. "I'm not violating any protocol. If you believe otherwise, you can speak with the court officer." He exhaled sharply through his nose, a sound of disbelief, maybe even amusement. "Lady, you're about 3 seconds from getting yourself removed," he said, a smirk twitching at the corner of his mouth like he was enjoying this more than he should. "Let's not make this a scene." Althea stood slowly, not because he told her to, but because she knew exactly what this moment was and who he thought she was. She didn't want to escalate it, not yet. She took 2 steps down the aisle, slid into the next row without a word, and sat back down with the same dignity she'd carried into the room. But in her chest, something had shifted. Not fear, not yet anger, but something colder, a calculation. The same one she'd made dozens of times as a young public defender when a judge had talked over her, or when a prosecutor had called her young lady instead of counselor, or when a bailiff had refused to let her through the gate because he didn't believe she was a lawyer. She smoothed her coat again, adjusted her sleeves, and stared ahead as the next case was called. But her heartbeat wasn't as calm now. Her breath had shortened. And from the corner of her eye she saw Mallory standing with his arms crossed again, watching her like a man watching a fuse burn too slow. He didn't say another word. He didn't have to. The point had been made. Not by law, not by procedure, but by power. The kind used in silence and proximity. The kind that made you feel smaller, not through force but through implication. When the session broke for recess, Althea stepped into the hallway, her heels clicking lightly on the tile, her coat swinging with purpose. She stopped by the restroom, locked the stall, and sat down, not because she needed to, but because she needed a moment to breathe. The quiet buzz of fluorescent lighting hummed above her. Distantly, someone ran water. She closed her eyes and let the moment pass through her cataloging, each detail like evidence, his words, his tone, the weight of the room, the silence of the others. And then she opened her eyes, exhaled once, and whispered almost to herself, "They still don't see us." When she stepped back out into the hallway, the courthouse felt different, not because anything had changed, but because she had. She walked past the security desk again, past the portraits on the wall, past the doors that led to smaller courtrooms and smaller dramas, all of them echoing the same truth she'd always known. The system wasn't broken. It was designed like this. But today, it had made a mistake. Today it picked the wrong woman to underestimate. The courtroom was unnaturally quiet for a space that had been echoing with movement and murmurs only moments before, like the entire room had inhaled and forgotten how to exhale. Althea Monroe remained, seated, her posture calm but not casual, spine straight but not rigid, as if the tension surrounding her couldn't quite find purchase on her skin. Her face gave away nothing, though her senses were sharp, alive, aware of every shift in weight behind her, every flicker of breath that didn't belong. Officer Mallory had been circling the edges of her space all morning, pushing boundaries with the practiced subtlety of someone who'd never been told no, by someone who mattered, and Althea could feel the moment inching towards something it could no longer pretend not to be. When the recess ended and people filed back into their seats, Mallory lingered near the aisle longer than necessary. He didn't look at her directly, not yet, but the way he adjusted his stance, the way his shoulders squared just a little tighter when he stepped beside her row, told her everything. He wasn't over it, not the challenge, not the refusal, and certainly not the calm with which she had walked away from his attempt to shrink her. The judge returned, announcements were made, and proceedings resumed. But the heat hadn't left the room. If anything, it had thickened, like humidity settling over a swamp before a storm breaks. As Althea listened to the next case, a simple dispute over a rental agreement, she kept one eye on the rhythm of the courtroom and the other on the pressure in her chest, a slow-building tension she hadn't felt since her days as a public defender, arguing in rooms where her voice was always the quietest. Then it happened. No warning, no escalation, just movement, swift, aggressive, final. Mallory stepped forward from his post without being called, crossed the space between them with quick, loud strides, and said loudly enough for the room to hear, "I told you to move, ma'am." Althea turned toward him, confused, not by the words, but by the deliberate sharpness in his tone. "Excuse me." He didn't answer. He reached out and grabbed her arm, not roughly but firmly enough to shock, and pulled her halfway out of her seat. Gasps erupted from the gallery. Someone whispered, "What the hell is he doing?" Althea pulled her arm back with sudden force and stood up full height, face to face with the officer. "You need to take a step back, Officer Mallory," she said clearly, her voice steady, her eyes locked to his. But that wasn't enough for him. Not today. Something snapped in his face, a twitch in his eye, a clench in his jaw, and before anyone could react, he raised his hand and struck her. As slap open palm, fast betrayal. It wasn't a shove or a threat or a momentary loss of control. It was a decision. The sound cracked through the courtroom like a gunshot, flesh meeting flesh in a moment of arrogance, rage, and entitlement. Althea's head turned with the blow, but she didn't stumble. She didn't cry out. She didn't even raise a hand to her cheek. She just stood there, her breath suddenly sharp in her nose, her hands curling slightly at her sides, her silence more deafening than any scream could have been. Everyone froze. The bailiff stood up stunned. The judge dropped his pen. A woman in the front row gasped so loudly it echoed. Mallory blinked as if surprised he'd actually done it, as if his own hand hadn't fully consulted his mind. Althea turned back to face him, slow, deliberate, and locked her gaze onto his like a steel pin sliding into place. Her lip was bleeding. A thin line of crimson curled at the corner of her mouth, but her voice didn't shake. "You just assaulted a judge," she said calmly, "in open court, in front of witnesses and cameras." Mallory's eyes flicked upward, instinctively scanning for the security cameras he had forgotten were there. He stepped back, his smirk gone, replaced by a strange twitching unease, a man who had just realized he stepped over a line that wouldn't fade with time. "Judge Monroe," the presiding judge said slowly from the bench standing halfway. "Are you?" "I'm Judge Althea Monroe," she said, her voice rising just enough to carry across the room, firm but not performative. "Appointed last month to preside over Circuit Court D. I was here to observe proceedings before formally taking the bench. Officer Mallory was informed I had a right to be here. He chose to ignore that. Then he chose to strike me." A long, pregnant silence. Then, like a dam-cracking movement, returned to the room all at once. The bailiff rushed forward. Court officers who had been paralyzed by shock now closed in on Mallory from either side. He backed up instinctively, hands raised, face, pale lips parted, as if trying to form words he no longer knew how to say. "This is a misunderstanding," he blurted, his voice cracking. "She wasn't wearing a robe, I didn't know." "You didn't need to know," the judge snapped from the bench, voice taut with fury. "You laid hands on a court observer, then you assaulted a sitting judge. You're done, officer. Cuff him." As Mallory's arms were pulled behind his back, his eyes darted around the room in a kind of frantic disbelief, searching for someone, anyone, to agree with him. But no one moved, no one spoke, not even the clerk who used to bring him coffee every morning. As the handcuffs clicked into place, Althea reached into her coat and pulled out her credentials, holding them up for the room to see her name in black letters beneath the gold seal of the state of Georgia. No one questioned it now. No one looked away. A courtroom once full of movement and voice was now still watching a man who had always believed himself untouchable finally meet a consequence he didn't see coming. And Althea, still bleeding, still upright, stood tall in that silence, the light catching in her eyes, not with triumph or satisfaction but with something colder. Something that said, "I expected this. I've lived my whole life expecting this, and you still didn't see me coming." Then she walked past him, slow, unshaken, coat-straight steps measured, and didn't look back. The courthouse had returned to its usual rhythm, the shuffle of legal documents, the measured clack of heels on tile, the faint murmur of overlapping voices in the hallway, but beneath the surface, a current had shifted, subtle yet undeniable. People spoke more carefully, eyes flickering toward corners, as if shadows now carried memory. Judge Althea Monroe, meanwhile, stood in a quiet back corridor behind the courtroom, pressing a folded handkerchief gently against her split lip, her reflection in the polished glass pane, more tired than bruised. The adrenaline had long since faded, replaced by something steadier, heavier, an awareness, not of what had just happened, but of what would come next. She didn't flinch when the door creaked behind her, nor when two court officers approached slowly, their expressions drawn tight with discomfort. One of them, a stocky man named Henderson, cleared his throat before speaking, his voice low. "Ma'am, are you all right?" She turned to face him, her hand lowering from her face, and nodded once. "I'm fine," she said. "But that's not the question that matters right now." The officer hesitated, then nodded, shame creeping behind his eyes as he murmured, "No, ma'am. I suppose it's not." In the courtroom, Mallory had already been led away in cuffs, a camera from the local news station catching the moment as he was loaded into the back of a cruiser. The footage hadn't aired yet, but Althea knew it was only a matter of time before it ignited. And still, despite everything, the slap, the disbelief, the gasps echoing like thunderclaps, what lingered in her mind wasn't the moment of impact, but the moment after, when no one moved until she spoke. That pause told her more about the room than any transcript ever could. Now, as she walked through the corridor toward the courthouse exit, passing clerks who pretended to be too busy to meet her eyes, she could feel the shift in energy with every step. She wasn't just the new judge anymore. She was the judge who had been struck. The judge who hadn't flinched. The judge whose silence had spoken louder than any outrage. And that image of her standing, blood on her lip and fire in her eyes, was already becoming a symbol. The question was a symbol of what? Outside, the air was thick with the kind of humidity that clung to the skin like guilt. Reporters had started to gather their notepads, trembling slightly in their hands, their eyes sharp with urgency. As she stepped through the doors, flashes popped, not aggressive but cautious, the way people photograph something they don't quite understand. She didn't stop, she didn't speak. She walked straight past them, with her head-high coat unbuttoned and fluttering slightly in the breeze, a woman who had been both target and testament. Later that evening, in the quiet warmth of her living room, she sat alone with the lights dimmed, the soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the only background noise. A mug of tea sat untouched on the table, the steam long faded, and her hands rested loosely in her lap. The television was off, the news unwatched. Her phone buzzed occasionally, texts from colleagues, voicemails from journalists, 2 missed calls from the governor's office, but she let it ring. The room around her felt like exhale after too many hours of holding breath. Her thoughts drifted not to the courtroom, but to her mother's hands calloused from decades of labor folding napkins just right for Sunday supper, even when no one came. To her father's voice, calm and low, telling her as a girl, "They'll test your peace, baby, not your fire, your peace." And tonight she felt that test had finally come, and she had passed, but not without cost. A soft knock at the door pulled her from memory. She stood slowly, her limbs still carrying the weight of the day, and opened it to find Elena, her longtime assistant, standing with a manila envelope in hand, and eyes red from tears. "They're already trying to spin it," Elena said, her voice cracking just a little. "The union's calling it unclear context. They're saying you provoked him by not identifying yourself." Althea took the envelope, gently nodded once, and said, "Thank you." She didn't ask who they were. She knew. She always knew. After Elena left, she opened the envelope to find transcripts of witness statements already being gathered by Internal Affairs, a still frame from the security camera showing Mallory mid-swing, and 3 printed tweets from court, spectators who had already begun to post. She stood like she'd been through worse. I've never seen a room go silent like that. She didn't raise a hand. She didn't have to. Althea leaned back into her chair, the papers spread across her lap, and allowed herself a long, steady breath. She knew what would follow. Meetings, hearings, statements prepared by lawyers more interested in optics than truth. But she also knew what couldn't be undone now. Mallory hadn't struck a woman. He hadn't even struck a judge. He had struck the veil of impunity that had protected men like him for decades, and it had torn in front of everyone. The next morning she stood in front of the mirror before heading to the emergency meeting called by the Judicial Council. Her lip was swollen but healing. Her eyes were clear. She fixed her collar, applied a single stroke of lip balm, and whispered to her reflection, "Let them try." Because what had happened yesterday was more than an incident, it was a reckoning. And now that it had begun, there would be no quieting it back into submission. That evening, as she returned home and finally sipped the tea she'd reheated twice, she stepped onto her porch to catch the last breath of dusk. The cicadas had begun their chorus, steady and relentless, like voices that would no longer be silenced. She looked out at the street, empty and peaceful, under the weight of nightfall, and smiled, not because she was unafraid, but because the world had finally seen her. And now it would have to remember. The next morning the courthouse didn't feel the same, and it wasn't just because the news vans had arrived before sunrise. Something in the air had shifted, quieter, heavier, as if the walls themselves had absorbed what happened the day before and now waited to see what would follow. The steps leading to the front entrance were clean as always, but a small cluster of flowers had been placed just to the side near the railing, wrapped in a white ribbon with no card. Althea saw them as she approached, her shoes clicking gently on the concrete, her breath steady, even as the weight of dozens of eyes began to settle on her shoulders. Reporters stood just beyond the ropes, microphones lowered, uncertain whether this was a woman to chase or to respect. She didn't stop. She didn't need to. The silence she carried with her was louder than any headline could be. The bailiffs at the entrance straightened the moment they saw her, their usual greetings swallowed by something between guilt and admiration. One of them opened the door without a word, and Althea walked through like she always had, controlled, centered, not hurried. Inside, the main hallway was lined with more courthouse staff than usual. Some pretended to be studying case files. Others stole glances when they thought she wasn't looking. A few held eye contact just long enough to offer a nod not of pity but of recognition. Word had already spread. Not just the headlines, those would come later, but the whispers, the phone calls, the court employees texting cousins who worked in the mayor's office, the judge who got hit, the officer in cuffs, the room that went dead silent, and the woman who stood taller after than she did before. She turned left at the elevator and took the stairs instead, needing the movement, needing the time. As she climbed, her fingers brushed the rail, cool and solid, grounding her in something physical, something real. At the landing between floors, she paused and closed her eyes for a moment, not in exhaustion but in clarity. This is what consequence looks like when it arrives wearing a suit. Not anger, not vengeance, just presence. On the second floor, a security officer stepped out of the courtroom to meet her. "Judge Monroe," he said, clearing his throat, "they're ready for you." His voice carried a note of caution but also respect. She nodded once past him and pushed open the heavy wooden doors of courtroom 2F. Inside the energy was different, compressed, nervous, full of eyes that didn't yet know where to land. The presiding judge, Harold Linton, sat upright in his chair, papers neatly aligned in front of him, his fingers steepled as he watched her approach. The district administrator sat to his right, and behind them a panel of judicial observers had been convened on short notice, their expressions unreadable but their purpose clear. This wasn't just about optics, this was about precedent. Althea didn't need to be told where to sit. She walked to the witness table, not the bench, and sat with the same poise she'd held since the moment Mallory laid hands on her. There was no lawyer beside her, no entourage, no statement prepared. She didn't need a script. She was the story. Judge Linton leaned forward slightly. "Judge Monroe," he began, "we appreciate your presence and recognize the complexity of the moment." His voice was smooth, trained, carefully neutral, the way veteran judges learn to speak when the walls might be listening. "I understand," she said, her tone even. "I'm here because it's important not to look away when something breaks." A few heads nodded slightly. Someone coughed. A pen clicked. "We've reviewed preliminary reports, and obviously there's an active criminal investigation underway," he continued. "But for the sake of institutional clarity, we need to confirm, are you intending to proceed with your judicial appointment as scheduled?" The question hung in the room like smoke. Althea looked directly at him, her face calm but sharp. "I was appointed to serve the people of this circuit," she said. "I still intend to do exactly that." There was no applause, no dramatic reaction. Just silence, the kind that comes not from doubt, but from the sudden realization that no one in the room would have had the courage to say it first. She didn't need their approval. She had already passed a different kind of trial, one that didn't come with gavels or transcripts, one that came in the form of a man with a badge who thought he could remind her of her place. After the meeting, she didn't linger. She walked the halls as she had before, but this time something followed her. Not fear, not resistance, but something quieter. Deference, maybe, or awe, or just the acknowledgement that she wasn't playing the same game everyone else had agreed to play. By the time she reached her chambers, the whispers had turned to calls. A voicemail from the governor's office requesting a conversation. A message from the state bar offering formal support. 2 emails from women she'd never met, both judges, both black, sharing stories of things that had happened in quieter courtrooms, without cameras, without headlines, and without consequences. She sat at her desk, removed her coat, and looked out the window. The courthouse lawn was empty now. The reporters had moved on. But the flowers were still there, catching the wind, gently bending but never breaking. In the silence of her office, she leaned back in her chair, closed her eyes for a moment, and let herself feel it, not triumph, not relief, but something deeper. A kind of stillness that comes only after a storm that doesn't sweep you away. She opened her eyes, reached for a pen, and signed the stack of orders waiting in her inbox. Her signature, steady, deliberate, unmistakably hers. And in that moment, with the light warming her desk, and the quiet holding around her like armor, she knew one thing for certain. She had not just taken back her place, she had made a new one. One no one would ever mistake again. In the days that followed, the incident headlines flared, voices clashed, and the story of the courtroom strike became bigger than Althea Monroe ever intended. News anchors debated legal precedent, panelists argued tone and temperament, and the internet did what it always did, splintered into outrage, denial, solidarity, and noise. But beneath the flash of breaking news and the roar of opinion, Althea remained silent, not because she lacked words, but because she knew when silence carried more weight than a statement ever could. She stayed behind the scenes, not hiding but watching carefully as the world revealed its reflexes, its blind spots, and its loyalties. She returned to the courthouse the very next day, not to preside, not to command, but to observe the way the system responded to itself when forced to acknowledge its fracture. What she noticed first wasn't the hush when she walked into the lobby, or the wide eyes from clerks who hadn't spoken to her before. It was the shift in how people stood straighter, more guarded, as if her presence reminded them of something fragile they didn't want exposed. Even those who had once barely nodded now held doors, offered greetings, and paused a beat too long before walking away. But Althea wasn't interested in performances. She wanted patterns. She spent her lunch breaks reviewing personnel files, combing through administrative complaints, following trails of language and conduct that had been quietly archived and quickly forgotten. She kept a notebook, small, leather-bound, unmarked, where she wrote down names, dates, expressions, phrases that caught her attention. Not to collect dirt, but to connect dots. And the dots were everywhere. One evening, just after sunset, she sat alone in her study blinds, drawn a stack of disciplinary reports spread out before her, like the pages of a crime novel, with no plot, just repetition. A knock came at the door, 3 soft taps, tentative. It was Clara James, a seasoned court clerk in her late 60s, who'd worked that circuit longer than most of the judges combined. Clara entered slowly, holding a brown envelope like it was something radioactive. "Didn't know if I should bring this," she said, eyes scanning the floor, "but I figured you might already know where to look." Althea accepted the envelope without speaking. Inside were scanned copies of internal memos, printouts of emails, and a short list of misconduct reports, all involving the same officer, Frank Mallory. None had ever led to discipline. Most had been marked inconclusive. One had been withdrawn under mutual agreement after the witness recanted a witness who happened to be a teenage girl, with no attorney and no adult present during her interview. Clara stood in the doorway, arms crossed tightly. "I'm retiring next spring," she said flatly. "Didn't think I'd have to see this kind of thing again before I left." Althea nodded slowly, her fingers brushing the edges of the documents. "You saw it before," Clara gave a tired smile. "You don't last 30 years in this building without seeing it. The only thing that changes is who they decide to believe." After Clara left, Althea stayed up well past midnight, her study lit by the soft amber glow of a desk lamp, the air still and heavy. She reread every memo, marked them with sticky notes, and began to build a timeline in her head, a chain of behavior too consistent to ignore, too protected to be random. It wasn't just about one officer. It was about a system that had learned how to keep its dirt tidy. The next morning she made a decision. She picked up her phone and called an old friend, Isaiah Brooks, a civil rights attorney in Atlanta known for winning cases most lawyers wouldn't touch. "You still chasing ghosts?" she asked when he picked up. "I chase what leaves a stain," he replied without missing a beat. "What do you have?" "Patterns," she said, "and enough smoke to suggest fire." 2 days later, Isaiah drove down to Savannah, bringing with him a portable scanner, 2 paralegals, and the kind of focused energy that only came from years of navigating hostile courtrooms. Together they pored over files, flagged inconsistencies, and started to draft a narrative carefully, cautiously, knowing that even the truth had to be shaped for people to recognize it. They didn't call the press. They didn't issue statements. They did the work. During one of their late-night sessions, Isaiah leaned back in his chair and exhaled slowly. "You know," he said, "if this sticks, it's not just going to be about Mallory. This'll reach farther than either of us can see." Althea met his eyes. "I know," she said. "That's why I'm not rushing it." She wasn't afraid of the fight. She'd seen bigger men fall harder. But what kept her grounded wasn't rage or even justice, it was precision. She wasn't just building a case. She was laying a foundation. And foundations didn't care about headlines, they cared about weight. By the end of the week, they had compiled a preliminary report, a 32-page document detailing the history of unchecked complaints, the inconsistency in Mallory's record, and the administrative patterns that allowed those actions to vanish from consequence. Althea read the entire report aloud once quietly to herself, just to feel the rhythm of it, the weight of each accusation, the silence between the lines. When she finished, she closed the folder, turned off the lamp, and walked out onto her porch. The air was warm, and the street below was quiet, the kind of suburban stillness that pretends nothing bad ever happens. But she knew better. She had seen the cracks behind the facades, the rot beneath the gloss. And now she had names, she had documents, she had a map. Standing there in the dark with the folder clutched under one arm and the cicadas humming like background noise to a truth too long ignored, she whispered to herself, "This time we don't blink." Then she turned and went back inside the screen door, clicking shut behind her like a quiet vow. It started slowly, like the way storm clouds gather on the edge of the sky, quiet at first, barely noticeable until you realize the light has shifted and the air feels different in your lungs. At first it was just a few messages, soft-voiced calls from community members, handwritten notes, slipped under doors, and cautious knocks at the edge of Althea's world, each one carrying a story no one had asked to hear before. They came not in crowds, but in fragments. A mother who remembered an officer parking too long in front of her house. A teacher who noticed that certain students were pulled aside more often but never asked why. An older man who once saw his grandson thrown to the ground over a bike that was never reported stolen. Althea listened, not with the posture of a judge, but with the quiet patience of someone who had learned long ago that silence was not absence, it was protection. People spoke more freely to her, not because of her title, but because she hadn't yet asked for anything in return. Her reputation had grown in the weeks following the courtroom incident, but what really moved people to come forward was not the strike itself, it was how she had stood afterward. Not broken, not loud, just present. She held meetings at community centers, sat on folding chairs with chipped paint, and drank weak coffee, served from cracked pots by grandmothers, who remembered what it was like to pray for their children every time they left the house. There were no press releases, no flyers, no formal initiatives, just people gathering quietly in living rooms and church basements, sharing memories they'd learned to bury under the rhythm of survival. "I didn't think anyone would care," one man told her, his hands trembling slightly as he held an envelope full of photos. "But when I saw what they did to you, I figured maybe someone finally would." Althea didn't promise results. She didn't offer timelines. She simply said, "Tell me everything," and meant it. Isaiah Brooks, the civil rights attorney assisting her investigation, began to compile these accounts into a growing archive. He hired a young team of interns, mostly law students, mostly women of color, who worked late into the night scanning statements, cross-referencing dates, verifying accounts that had never made it into official reports. They built a digital map of patterns of complaints that had gone unanswered, and officers whose names appeared with unsettling consistency. The more they found, the clearer it became. What happened to Althea hadn't been an isolated act of aggression. It was the most visible example of a culture that had learned how to bend the rules without ever appearing to break them. One afternoon, Althea sat with a retired police officer named Vernon Hayes, a quiet man with a soft southern drawl and eyes that never stopped watching the door. He had served 28 years in the same precinct that had once protected Mallory, and he had left early, long before his pension matured. "They don't push you out with force," he told her. "They just start making it hard to breathe." He brought with him a cardboard box, worn thin at the corners, filled with old notebooks, copies of shift logs, and handwritten letters never mailed. It was his record, his proof of things. He'd witnessed things he couldn't unsee. Names, incidents, conversations overheard in locker rooms, and silenced in staff meetings. "You'll want to be careful," he said softly, "because once this moves, it doesn't stop." Althea nodded, absorbing the warning without flinching. "It already started," she replied. "We're just the first ones listening." News of the investigation began to spread, not because they announced it, but because people couldn't stop talking. Word of mouth became the fuel. Barbershop chairs turned into briefing rooms. Church prayer lines became witness networks. A single mother named Letitia offered her living room for weekly gatherings. A local youth counselor passed out flyers to parents who had stories but no idea where to bring them. And quietly, without fanfare or slogans, a movement formed not of outrage, but of resolve. Althea kept her focus narrow. She knew better than to get lost in the noise. Each day she reviewed reports, sat through depositions, and walked into her courtroom with the same dignity she carried on the day Mallory struck her. She didn't speak publicly. She didn't post statements. But her silence was not retreat, it was momentum-gathering force. And the system felt it. One morning she received a package at her office, no return address, just a thick manila envelope and a single note that read, "This was never supposed to get out." Inside were internal affairs memos, sealed files referencing 3 past investigations against Mallory, all marked closed due to insufficient evidence, despite detailed witness statements and photos. It was the break they needed. She handed the files to Isaiah without ceremony. He read through them slowly, jaw tightening with each page. "You realize what this means," he said finally. "It's not just him. It never was." "I know," she said, her voice calm. "But now we can prove it." That evening Althea walked the perimeter of her neighborhood, as she often did when her mind was too full of names and timelines. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the pavement, and the houses seemed quieter than usual. As she passed an older couple sitting on their porch, the woman stood slowly and called out, "Judge Monroe." Althea turned and offered a gentle smile. "Yes, ma'am." The woman's eyes held something warm but heavy. "Thank you," she said simply, "for not letting it be just another story we have to forget." Althea nodded, her throat tightening slightly, and continued her walk without reply. As the sky deepened into twilight and the streetlights buzzed faintly to life, she felt something settle in her, not pride, not certainty, but purpose. The kind that doesn't shout, doesn't waver, doesn't need to be seen. Just one foot after another, steady on the path she had already chosen. The backlash didn't come all at once. It arrived in carefully phrased memos, delayed approvals, sidelong glances, and meetings that were suddenly rescheduled without explanation. At first it was subtle, the kind of resistance that slips between the cracks of professionalism, hiding behind polite smiles and bureaucratic red tape. But Althea Monroe knew exactly what she was watching, a system circling the wagons trying to protect itself from the truth she had set into motion. When people can't argue with the facts, they argue with your tone, your timing, your presence. And now, with the momentum of the investigation gaining traction, and Mallory's name inching closer to formal indictment, the institution began to tremble, not because it was ready to fall, but because it didn't want to change. The police union held a press conference 3 days after the leaked files began to circulate online, flanked by attorneys in dark suits and officers in ceremonial uniforms. Their spokesperson delivered a carefully rehearsed statement, citing due process, the presumption of innocence, and what he called deep concerns over media-fueled narratives. He never mentioned Althea by name, but the message was clear. "Officers deserve protection from politicized attacks," he said, his voice calm, his jaw tight. "We will not allow good men to be destroyed by public opinion." The room was silent as the cameras clicked, and outside a crowd of protesters held handmade signs just beyond the press barricade. Some signs carried Althea's name, others simply read, "We saw it, we heard it. We believe her." In her chambers, Althea sat with the statement playing on a muted screen, her fingers steepled beneath her chin, her face unreadable. Behind her, the blinds were drawn against the afternoon sun, casting long shadows across the desk, where stacks of affidavits and transcripts waited to be sorted. Isaiah stood near the door, arms crossed, watching her carefully. "They're drawing lines," he said finally, "trying to reframe this before the case even goes to court." Althea didn't look away from the screen. "They always do," she replied. "They count on people being too tired to keep looking." And tired she was. But not in the way they hoped, not in the way that leads to retreat. It was a deeper exhaustion, one she carried quietly, like the weight of history pressed into the space between her ribs. Not just her own pain, but the collective memory of women who had been silenced, questioned, softened until their truths no longer made noise. The real test wasn't in the courtroom. It was in moments like this, when the room grows quiet, when the pressure builds slowly, when powerful men with spotless reputations start whispering about decorum and divisiveness, as if the wound itself were the problem, not the hand that caused it. Behind the scenes, officers who once made small talk in elevators now avoided eye contact entirely. The police department released a statement affirming their commitment to accountability while quietly assigning new legal counsel to several senior officers whose names had surfaced in the widening investigation. Requests for public records were suddenly delayed. Clerks became less responsive. An anonymous letter appeared in Althea's mailbox, typed in all caps, and ending with the words, "You're tearing this city apart." She read it once, folded it in half, and filed it away, not because it frightened her, but because it told her exactly how much closer she was getting. She started carrying a second phone, not out of paranoia but preparation. She instructed her staff to back up everything twice. She changed her walking route each morning, alternating between courthouse entrances, and still she arrived every day on time in heels, with her head held high and her case files tucked neatly under her arm. Because image mattered. Not for vanity, but for message. They needed to see that she was not rattled, that she would not be rushed or erased or baited into fury. Her calm was not detachment, it was strategy. When her name appeared in a political op-ed, accusing her of jeopardizing judicial neutrality by inserting herself into an active police matter, she didn't respond. She didn't need to. The piece was dissected within hours by lawyers, professors, and journalists who had been quietly watching her work unfold. It backfired spectacularly, but the smear campaign didn't stop, it simply got smarter. Whispers began in city council chambers. Closed-door meetings filled with phrases like optics and long-term damage. Althea was invited to a private conversation with two council members, both of whom had previously praised her appointment. One leaned forward with concern, the other with practiced empathy. "You've done good work," the first said. "But we're asking whether this might be the moment to de-escalate. Let the system do its job," the second added. "Sometimes silence is the most powerful statement." Althea smiled, then slow and deliberate, the way someone smiles after realizing they've walked into a room already set for their dismissal. If silence was powerful, she said, we wouldn't be sitting here at all. She stood, thanked them for their time, and left the meeting without waiting for permission. Later that night, she sat on her porch with a glass of water and a blanket draped across her knees, the evening air wrapped in the scent of cut grass and distant rain. Across the street, a group of teenagers rode past on bicycles, laughing too loudly the way kids do when they're trying to stretch the last bit of summer from the sky. Inside her inbox pinged 3 new emails, 2 more interviews, 1 request for a public comment. She didn't open any of them. Instead, she stared out at the horizon, where the sky was just starting to fold into blue and gold, and let herself feel it, the ache, the anger, the knowing. And then she whispered softly to the night around her, "They're afraid of what happens if we don't stop." And for the first time in days, she smiled, not from triumph, but from truth. Because fear in the powerful is not a sign to retreat. It is a sign to keep going. The courthouse was nearly full by the time Althea stepped through the side entrance, a quiet figure in navy blue, her heels tapping a deliberate rhythm on the tile floor. The courtroom had been cleared and reassembled twice in the past 24 hours to accommodate the cameras, the security, and the last-minute scramble to control a moment that had already outgrown the people trying to manage it. Outside, protesters lined the sidewalks in both directions, some holding signs that bore her name in block letters, others simply watching, waiting, holding their breath like something sacred was about to be decided. The trial hadn't even begun, but the weight in the air felt like a verdict had already been passed, not by the law, but by the country watching it unfold. Inside, the lighting was sharp and unforgiving, catching the edges of every face with the same cold honesty that courtrooms were known for. Althea moved through the gallery quietly, her eyes forward, her expression unreadable, not guarded but intentional, the way someone walks when they know all eyes are measuring more than their steps. At the plaintiff's table, Isaiah Brooks was already seated, flipping through a worn folder with quiet precision, his glasses perched low on his nose, his brow furrowed in thought. He looked up when she approached, and without a word slid a sheet of notes toward her. She didn't read them right away. She just sat down, smoothed the fabric of her skirt, and exhaled like someone finally reaching the surface after holding breath beneath a current. The room filled slowly with whispers, the low rustle of papers, the hum of tension that couldn't be named. Across the aisle, Officer Frank Mallory entered in a navy suit, not a uniform, his posture stiff, chin tilted, upward eyes, darting like he was trying to remember who he was before all this began. His attorney followed close behind, whispering something into his ear, a well-practiced expression of composure painted onto his face like stage makeup. The cameras clicked. No one smiled. When the judge entered and called the room to order, the stillness became absolute. The court clerk read through formalities like ritual, and then the real work began. Isaiah opened with a tone that was neither emotional nor clinical, just clear. He laid out the facts with surgical precision, framing them not around outrage but around evidence: body cam footage, witness affidavits, disciplinary records. The transcript of the moment when Althea was struck, the courtroom gasping on camera as a man in uniform lost his temper and tried to reclaim control with force. When the video was played, the room didn't blink. There was no talking, no coughing, no shifting in seats, just the sound of breath being held. The moment of impact, sharp, sudden, undeniable, played on the screen, with no music, no filters, no commentary. And when it ended, the silence that followed felt like something sacred had just been named and grieved in the same breath. Althea didn't look at the screen as it played. She'd already seen it too many times. Instead, she watched the jury, 6 women, 6 men, all of them shifting slightly in their seats, trying to find footing inside a truth that was now theirs to carry. Their faces didn't betray much, but their stillness said enough. Then came the witnesses. First, a courtroom clerk who'd been present that day, a woman in her 50s with quiet nerves and a steady voice, who recalled the look in Mallory's eyes just before he struck. He wasn't confused, she said softly. He was angry. She hadn't done anything wrong, and he needed to remind her who held the power. Next was Clara James, the longtime court staffer who had handed over internal documents weeks before the investigation began, in earnest. Her testimony was short, factual, and devastating. She listed names, referenced memos, and pointed to signatures. Mallory had signed on warnings that never reached consequence. When asked why she had never reported it before, she looked down at her hands, then replied simply, "Because I knew no one would listen until now." One by one they came forward: an older black pastor who once filed a complaint that vanished, a retired police officer who had warned his superiors about Mallory's temperament, a teenager who had been pulled over and humiliated years before this case ever made headlines. Their stories wove together not in a spectacle, but in a slow, deliberate threading of pain that revealed a pattern too complex to dismiss as coincidence and too clear to ignore. Mallory didn't testify. His attorney advised against it. But when the prosecution rested and the defense began their closing remarks, Althea could feel the shift again, that slight recalibration of narrative, where the system tried to remember how to protect its own. The defense attorney spoke of stress, of misunderstanding, of how Mallory had served the community for nearly 2 decades with distinction. He talked about the chaos of that day and the challenge of reading intent in a single frame of video. He never apologized. He never acknowledged Althea by name. Isaiah stood for the rebuttal, walking slowly to the center of the room with a kind of stillness that pulled everyone forward. "You've heard the stories," he said. "You've seen the footage. This isn't about one bad moment. It's about what happens when we let the wrong people believe they're untouchable." He paused, letting the weight of the room settle again. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't strike back. She didn't even tell the world what had happened. The footage did that. The people who watched it did that. All she did was survive it with dignity. Althea watched from her seat, hands clasped gently, eyes steady on the floor. She didn't need to add anything. The truth had already spoken. By the time the jury was dismissed for deliberation, the air in the courtroom was thick with finality. It took them less than 3 hours. When they returned, the courtroom stood as the verdict was read. Guilty on assault, guilty on abuse of power, guilty on obstruction of duty. There were no cheers, just quiet. Not the quiet of fear, but of something deeper: relief, perhaps, or the moment just before healing begins. As Althea exited the courtroom, passing rows of people who had shown up not for drama but for justice, a young girl standing in the back row reached out and handed her a folded piece of paper. No words. Just a small drawing: Althea, in her judge's robe, standing tall. She smiled, tucked the drawing into her coat, and stepped into the hallway where the light was just beginning to soften through the tall courthouse windows. And in that moment, with the weight of the verdict behind her and the voices of the unheard echoing still in her memory, she felt no vindication, just clarity, and the calm certainty that no one would ever mistake her silence for weakness again. The sentencing hearing took place on a crisp autumn morning, the kind that smelled faintly of pine and old brick, with wind that tugged at coat collars and scattered yellow leaves across the courthouse steps. The air felt clearer than it had in weeks, as if the city had exhaled something it had been holding far too long. Inside the courtroom buzzed not with chaos, but with a quieter anticipation, the kind that settles into bones and reminds you that justice, when it finally arrives, does not shout. It speaks low and carries weight. Every seat in the gallery was filled. Reporters, family members, legal staff, and ordinary citizens who had taken time off work just to witness what came next. Althea arrived through the side corridor as she had during the trial, flanked by no one, her presence steady, not rehearsed. She walked past rows of familiar faces, many of whom had never spoken to her directly but had watched her, supported her, and in their own way carried her through the storm. Her eyes met those of a courtroom clerk who had testified days earlier, just a glance, soft but firm, and in it lived an entire history of shared silence, finally broken. She took her seat at the front, folding her hands neatly in her lap, her breath slow and measured, her gaze unwavering. Mallory sat just across from her, his face thinner jaw, tighter suit, a little less crisp than before. The bravado that once pulsed beneath his uniform had been replaced by something duller, fatigue maybe, or the dawning realization that power once lost doesn't come back the same way it left. His lawyer shuffled papers beside him, his expression carefully controlled, but the tension in his shoulders betrayed the growing sense that no clever phrasing could soften what was already carved into the record. The judge entered with little fanfare, his robe billowing slightly as he took the bench, nodding to both sides before turning to the matter at hand. "We are here today to determine sentencing in the matter of the state of Georgia versus Frank Mallory," he said, his voice even, practiced and unmistakably final. Isaiah Brooks rose first, his voice quieter than usual, not out of hesitation but intention. "Your Honor," he began, "this isn't just about one incident. It's about a pattern. It's about what happens when we confuse authority with impunity and forget that a badge is not a shield from accountability. This courtroom saw the truth with its own eyes, and the verdict made it clear: actions have consequences." He paused, then added, "We're not asking for vengeance. We're asking for reflection that carries weight, for a sentence that tells every person in uniform that the law applies to them too." Mallory's lawyer countered with a familiar rhythm, pleas for leniency, references to years of service, reminders of personal hardship, and a closing statement that framed the officer's actions as tragic but uncharacteristic. He described a man under pressure, not a man out of control. But no one in the room leaned forward to hear more. No one nodded in agreement. Even the jury, dismissed days ago, had returned voluntarily, sitting together in the back row, as if what they'd started could only end if they bore witness. Then the judge turned to Althea. "Judge Monroe," he said gently, "you are under no obligation to speak. But if there is something you wish to say, the court will hear it now." Althea stood slowly, her body composed but not rigid, her voice calm but full. "I was struck in a courtroom in broad daylight, not because I posed a threat but because I refused to disappear," she began. "I didn't fight back that day, not because I couldn't, but because I chose not to become what they assumed I already was." She took a breath. "This sentence won't undo the harm, not just to me, but to every person who's ever been told their truth. Doesn't matter unless it comes with bruises or badges. But it can say something. It can say that even here, in the places where silence once lived, we can still draw lines. We can still say enough." She sat down without looking at Mallory, her words hanging in the air like a bell still vibrating long after it has been struck. The judge nodded once, then turned back to the defendant. "Mr. Mallory, you were entrusted with a responsibility you chose to betray. You were given authority not for dominance but for protection, and you violated that oath in the very room where justice is meant to reside. The court finds that your actions were not momentary but part of a sustained pattern of abuse, enabled by a culture that too often turns its face away from misconduct in uniform." He paused, letting the silence settle again. "For these reasons, and in the interest of both accountability and deterrence, you are hereby sentenced to 12 years in a state correctional facility with no eligibility for early release." The gavel came down. A sharp sound. Final, clean. Mallory didn't speak. Didn't move. His attorney placed a hand lightly on his shoulder, as if to anchor him to the moment, but the former officer stared forward, expression blank, as court deputies stepped to either side and asked him to stand. The rustle of chains, the click of cuffs, the soft shuffle of worn shoes on marble tile. No anger, no yelling, just process precise and irreversible. Outside, the crowd had begun to shift as word of the sentencing spread. Some clapped softly, others embraced. A few just stood quietly watching the courthouse windows, as if hoping to catch a glimpse of something true behind the glass. Inside, Althea gathered her things slowly, each movement deliberate, like she was placing weight back into her body one breath at a time. Isaiah joined her at the bench, his hand resting briefly on her shoulder. "It won't fix everything," he said. She nodded. "It's not supposed to," she replied. "It just has to mean something." As she stepped out into the sunlight, the wind caught the edge of her coat, lifting it gently like a flag, not of victory but of presence. And in that quiet moment, no speeches, no flashbulbs, no applause. She felt something settle inside her that had been waiting to land for a very long time. Not peace, not closure, but truth standing upright and finally unafraid. The first time Althea stepped back into her courtroom after the trial, it was early, quiet, and empty, just as she needed it to be. The wooden benches stood in neat rows beneath the high-arched windows, sunlight pooling across the floor in soft rectangles, as if the building itself was holding its breath, waiting for her to return. She paused just inside the door, her fingertips brushing the smooth edge of the railing, and let the silence wrap around her like a familiar coat. The echoes in the space were different now, not louder, not quieter, but more honest. She could feel it in the floor beneath her heels, in the gentle creak of the chair, when she finally sat behind the bench, in the weight of her own breath as it settled into the air. There were no cameras that day, no reporters, no security detail hovering nearby. Just her and the space where it had all begun, where power had been misused and reclaimed, where truth had been made visible not through rage, but through restraint. She sat for a long time without moving her hands, resting lightly on the wooden surface before her, her eyes scanning the room not out of caution but out of gratitude. This place, once just a workplace, had become something else entirely. It had become a crucible, and she had walked out of it still whole. When the staff began to arrive, they did so quietly, their voices low, their movements careful, as if they understood that something sacred was unfolding. Clara James, the veteran clerk with decades behind her, was the first to greet her. She didn't say much, just placed a case file on the desk, nodded, and smiled with the kind of smile that carried history. Others followed. The bailiff nodded solemnly as he adjusted his jacket, and even the new intern, nervous and wide-eyed, offered a quiet, "Good morning, Judge Monroe," as she passed. It wasn't ceremony. It wasn't performance. It was acknowledgement. When court resumed, it did so without fanfare. The first case was a landlord-tenant dispute, followed by a child custody review, then a series of traffic appeals that blurred together in their routine frustration. But Althea didn't mind. She welcomed the normalcy, the hum of small human conflicts, the quiet rhythm of justice, doing what it was supposed to do, show up. Her gavel didn't fall any harder, her voice didn't carry any more weight than it had before, but the energy in the room had changed. People sat straighter, attorneys chose their words more carefully, and no one questioned her authority, not because of fear, but because they had seen what it meant to misuse it. During the lunch recess, she stepped outside to the small garden that wrapped around the courthouse, a space few ever used, but one she had come to rely on. The sky was pale blue, stretched thin by the sun, and a breeze tugged gently at the sleeves of her blazer. She walked the path slowly, her footsteps crunching over fallen leaves, her thoughts drifting back to all the people who had spoken up during the trial, ordinary citizens who hadn't planned to be brave but had chosen to be anyway. Their stories still lived in her fragments of pain and resilience, each one adding weight to her decisions, each one reminding her why she couldn't allow the system to slip back into silence. She sat on the bench beneath the old magnolia tree and closed her eyes, not to escape, but to listen. The rustle of branches above her, the distant sound of a child laughing on the sidewalk, the faint buzz of traffic 3 blocks away, it all reminded her that life kept moving even when justice moved slow. Her phone buzzed in her coat pocket. A message from Isaiah. Federal inquiry might open next week. Call when you're ready. She read it, smiled faintly, and slipped the phone back without replying. She would call, just not today. Today was not about what came next. It was about returning to the life she had almost lost beneath the weight of what had been done to her. It was about presence, about grounding, about sitting in the place where her voice had once been tested and knowing she had never truly lost it. Back in the courtroom that afternoon, an older woman approached the bench after her case had been dismissed. She was slight, with a cane and a tremble in her hands, but her eyes were sharp, focused, steady. "Judge Monroe," she said softly, "I just wanted to say, thank you for standing." Althea looked at her not as a judge but as a woman, and replied, "Thank you for seeing." The woman nodded, smiled, and turned to go. It was a small moment, no more than 20 seconds long, but it stayed with her. Long after the court adjourned and the lights were dimmed, long after the papers were filed and the door closed behind her, Long after she returned to her home, poured a glass of tea, and sank into the quiet of her living room, letting the day fall away like dust shaken from the hem of a coat. That night, she sat at her desk by the window, the city lights flickering like distant stars, and opened the drawer where she kept the folded drawing that little girl had once handed her. She smoothed it out gently, running her thumb across the pencil lines, the simple rendering of her standing tall behind the bench robe, billowing face strong. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She just looked at it for a long time, her heart full, her breath slow, her presence whole. And for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to feel something she hadn't dared hold on to before. Peace, not because the world was fixed, but because she was no longer pretending it was broken beyond repair. It was a Thursday morning when the call came, a quiet vibration on the desk just after sunrise, the screen lit with a number Althea didn't recognize but somehow already understood. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she sat for a moment in the quiet of her kitchen, fingers wrapped around a mug of tea that had long since gone cold, listening to the hush of the world before it fully woke. The birds outside chirped in short bursts, the kind that came before traffic picked up, and lawnmowers hummed, and for that single moment the stillness felt like permission to breathe before it all began again. When she finally picked up the phone, the voice on the other end was calm and clipped with the practiced neutrality of someone reading from a prepared statement. "Judge Monroe," the man said, "this is Special Agent Delgado with the Department of Justice. I'm calling to inform you that the federal inquiry into misconduct within the Savannah Police Department has been formally opened. Your cooperation will be requested in the coming weeks, and your testimony may be essential to the civil rights violations under review." He paused, waiting for her to respond, but Althea said nothing at first. Her heart didn't race, her breath didn't catch. She simply closed her eyes and let the words settle around her like dust floating through sunlight. "Thank you," she said finally, voice even but low. "I'll be ready." The call ended with the usual formalities, but the room around her had already changed. Not physically, no lights flickered, no doors creaked, but something in the air felt different, heavier, as if a curtain had been pulled back, and what lay behind it could no longer be ignored. She stood, moved to the sink, and emptied the cold tea into the drain, the water echoing softly as it swirled away. For a long time she just stood there, her hands braced on the edge of the counter, her shoulders pulled tight, not with fear but with focus. That afternoon she met Isaiah at the usual cafe, 2 blocks from the courthouse, a quiet place with chipped tile floors and an espresso machine that wheezed like an old man catching his breath. He was already seated by the window, a legal pad open in front of him, notes scribbled in his small, controlled handwriting. When she sat down, he didn't greet her with pleasantries. He just slid the notepad across the table and said, "We've got a timeline to build." She nodded, scanning the list of names, dates, and internal files referenced in quick shorthand. "Delgado called me this morning," she said. Isaiah didn't look surprised. "They've been circling for weeks," he replied. "They just needed someone brave enough to open the front door." They spoke for nearly an hour, their conversation quiet but urgent, broken only by the waitress refilling their cups and asking with a faint southern twang, "Y'all good?" Althea smiled and nodded, and the waitress moved along without another word. They weren't talking about retaliation anymore. They were talking about records, subpoenas, and long-forgotten evidence suddenly made relevant again. They were talking about how to hold something together when the people who built it had spent decades denying it was cracked. By the time they parted, the sun had dipped low behind the rooftops, casting long shadows across the sidewalk as Althea made her way back to the courthouse. She didn't go inside, she just stood across the street, looking up at the tall windows that reflected the fading light, and remembered what it had felt like to stand inside that courtroom, bleeding but unbent. She remembered the sound of the gavel, the collective breath of witnesses, the trembling voice of a woman who had once said, "I didn't think they'd believe me." The memory didn't hurt, it fortified. She crossed her arms loosely across her chest, not to shield herself, but to anchor something inside her that had started to shift again. Not anger, not even grief. Just purpose refined by pressure, sharpened by doubt, steadied by truth. Over the next week, the calls came more frequently. Journalists, investigators, colleagues from other districts who had watched the trial unfold like a mirror and now wondered if they too should start digging. Some offered support. Others warned her to be careful, but no one asked her to stop. Not anymore. The silence that once surrounded these stories had been pierced, and like a bell rung in an old church, the echo had already traveled too far to be called back. She began compiling her own documentation at night in a manila folder she kept tucked behind the bookshelf in her home office. Witness statements, old photographs, copies of emails she had once been told to delete. Each piece was labeled not just with dates and initials, but with fragments of what had been said to her in hushed tones across office desks and coffee counters. It's just how things are here. You don't want to be the one who speaks up. We've all seen it, we just never thought it would matter. Now it did. One evening she sat in that quiet room with the folder open before her papers spread like puzzle pieces and realized something simple but powerful truth wasn't the hardest part to find. It was the will to look at it once you did. And she had looked. She had watched the whole thing unfold and still chosen to walk straight into it. Not because she wanted to be brave, but because being brave had become the only option left. Later that week she was invited to speak at a legal symposium on judicial integrity, a gathering of judges and lawyers from across the region. She hesitated at first, unsure if her presence would be seen as provocation or leadership. But when she stepped to the podium dressed not in power but in truth, the room fell silent, not in judgment but in respect. She didn't talk about herself. She talked about systems. She talked about stories. She talked about the courage of people who had never sworn an oath, never worn a robe, but had decided that enough was enough. And when she finished, she stepped away from the microphone not to applause, but to something deeper, a standing room full of people who had seen what she did and knew finally that they could no longer look away. That night, as she walked home beneath a sky littered with stars, the weight in her chest was not lighter, but it was clearer. The world hadn't changed, but she had. And so had the people who once stood in silence, now walking forward beside her one step at a time. Some weeks after the sentencing, Althea found herself in a quiet corner of the city library, away from the murmurs of students and the steady hum of overhead lights, where the morning sun streamed through tall, dust-lined windows, painted golden rectangles across the faded carpet. She wasn't there for research or public appearances, just a moment of solitude, a pocket of stillness where she could breathe without being observed. The library had always been sacred to her long before the robe, long before the courtroom, long before anyone knew her name beyond the bar association. As a child, it had been her sanctuary, a place where her mother whispered, "Let the books show you what silence really means." And now, as a woman whose silence had once been mistaken for submission, she understood that lesson in ways no child could. She sat at a table near the back, a notebook open in front of her, its pages half filled with scribbled thoughts that weren't meant to become speeches or rulings, but reflections, pieces of herself she needed to hold on to before they were buried beneath the weight of other people's expectations. Outside, the trees rustled in the wind branches, shifting like slow dancers, casting gentle shadows that moved across the floor, in sync with time she no longer tried to chase. The city had begun to move on, or at least pretend to. The headlines had cooled, and the protests had quieted into community meetings and local initiatives that carried just enough momentum to feel like progress. But Althea knew better than to believe in easy victories. Systems didn't change because a man was convicted or a courtroom held its breath. They changed because people kept showing up after the crowd had gone home, after the applause faded when no one was watching. And she had no intention of leaving her post simply because the camera crews had packed up. She flipped to a new page in the notebook and wrote a name she hadn't said aloud in years, her father's. She didn't write anything else, just that single name in the center of the page, as if his memory alone could hold space for the conversation she couldn't yet bring herself to have. He had passed away before she made her first closing argument, but he'd known even then what kind of world his daughter was walking into. "Your skin," he once told her, "will speak louder than your voice. So make sure your voice never whispers." She didn't understand that fully at the time. Now it lived in her marrow. A librarian passed nearby, her shoes tapping lightly against the linoleum, pausing for a moment to adjust a shelf of books before moving on. Althea looked up, watched her disappear around the corner, and found herself thinking of all the women who had moved through this city with power stitched beneath their silence. Teachers, nurses, mothers, clerks, each one holding the world. Together, without ever being told their hands mattered. The thought made her sit a little straighter, the pencil in her hand hovering above the page before she began to write again. This time not a name but a sentence. Justice is not a moment, it's a posture. Her phone buzzed gently in her bag. She didn't rush to check it. Instead, she closed the notebook softly and tucked it under her arm, rising from the chair with the slow grace of someone who no longer felt the need to hurry toward things she could meet with patience. When she stepped outside, the air was crisp, scented with pine, and something distant, maybe firewood, maybe memory. A man sweeping the sidewalk near the library entrance glanced up and nodded toward her. "Morning, Judge," he said. His voice was warm, unforced, like he wasn't greeting a public figure, just someone whose presence mattered. "Morning," she replied, offering a small smile, the kind that reached her eyes. She walked slowly through the city, past storefronts and school buses, past the courthouse, where her image still lived in whispers and stares, and stopped at a small mural that had recently gone up on the side of an old pharmacy. It depicted a black woman seated on a courtroom bench, not Althea specifically but unmistakably, inspired by her stance, her presence, her defiance. Her hand hovered above the gavel, her eyes looked forward. And around her words were written in a looping scrawl, "Dignity has a name. Truth has a voice." A young girl stood near the mural sketchpad in hand, copying the lines in careful strokes, her brow furrowed in concentration. When she noticed Althea watching, she straightened quickly, shy but curious. "Are you—" she started, then hesitated. Althea stepped closer, her smile widening just a little. "I'm someone who sees what you're doing," she said gently. "And it's beautiful." The girl beamed, cheeks flushing with a pride too pure to be hidden. "I want to be a judge, too. Someday." "Then start now," Althea said. "Not with a robe, with how you see people, how you hear them, how you hold your ground." The girl nodded, and Althea watched her turn back to the drawing pencil, moving with renewed focus, the lines on the paper coming alive with quiet power. By the time Althea returned home that afternoon, the wind had picked up leaves dancing in little eddies across her porch, the sky shifting toward dusk. She set the notebook on her desk, made a cup of tea, and stood by the window watching the day fold into itself, like a story coming to rest between chapters. She didn't feel triumphant. She didn't feel vindicated. What she felt was presence, a deep, steady knowing that she was exactly where she was meant to be, not because the world had confirmed her place, but because she had claimed it with her own two hands. And as she looked out at the neighborhood she had chosen to serve, not govern, not preach to, but serve, she whispered something not to herself, but to the air, the earth, the ancestors, whose names were carved into the corners of her life. "I am still here." And for that moment it was enough. The ceremony was simple. No orchestra, no cameras, no gilded invitations, just a room filled with people who had learned in their own way what justice looked like when it walked into a space and refused to shrink. The governor spoke first, his voice steady, political but not distant, acknowledging the fight that had brought them all there without pretending it had been easy. He used words like integrity, courage, and transformation, but Althea didn't hear them as praise. She heard them as markers, reminders of what had been required of her just to be believed. She stood near the front in a black blazer and white blouse, her hands folded calmly at her waist, her back straight, not from pride but from practice. She hadn't asked for a commendation. When the letter had arrived weeks ago inviting her to accept the city's highest civic honor, she had paused before opening it, already aware of the delicate dance between gratitude and performance that often came with such moments. But she had accepted not for herself, but for the people who had walked beside her through the quiet and the fury, those who had given testimony, who had borne witness, who had refused to let the story die when the noise faded. As her name was called and she stepped up to the podium, the room hushed, not with awe, but with attention. The kind of attention that didn't demand spectacle, only truth. She took the microphone, adjusted it slightly, and began with a voice that was calm, clear, and shaped by the weight of everything she had carried. "I didn't stand in that courtroom to be seen," she said. "I stood because silence had already taken too much, from too many." The crowd was still unmoving, listening with the kind of stillness that only came from understanding, not with the mind but with the body. She went on, not rehearsed, not reading, just speaking from a place she rarely allowed the world to see. She spoke of community, of responsibility, of what it meant to be accountable to more than one's own comfort. She didn't mention Mallory's name. She didn't need to. This moment wasn't about him. It was about reclaiming something that had been buried in the foundation of their institutions, something older than legislation, something deeper than rulings. Dignity. For those who had never been allowed to raise their voice. For those who had only ever been called when something went wrong. For those who had walked into courtrooms not expecting fairness, but hoping for mercy. When she finished, the applause came not in a rush, but like a slow tide building, steady, unwavering. She stepped down, shook hands, posed for a photo she would never hang, and returned to her seat with her heart steady, her breath full. The award was a heavy bronze plaque mounted on a dark wooden base, engraved with her name, the date, and the phrase, "For relentless service to justice and community." She traced the edge with her thumb once, then set it gently in her lap and looked toward the exit doors, already thinking of the next docket waiting on her desk. Later that evening, long after the hall had emptied and the voices had faded into distant echoes, Althea sat on her porch with a glass of iced tea, watching the last of the daylight fold itself into the quiet of evening. A few houses down, someone grilled dinner, the faint scent of charcoal and rosemary floating lazily through the air. The cicadas had just begun their song, loud but oddly comforting, a sign that the night was fully here and the day had done what it needed to do. She leaned back in her chair, the plaque resting on the small table beside her, and looked up at the stars, blinking quietly into view one by one. She didn't feel triumphant. She didn't feel celebrated. What she felt was rooted, like something inside her had finally found its footing after years of shifting under the weight of expectation. It wasn't pride. It wasn't relief. It was stillness. A neighbor's child called out from across the yard, "Hi, Judge Monroe," and she lifted her hand in a soft wave. The child giggled and returned to his game, and she smiled, not because of the recognition, but because of the normalcy. She took a long sip of tea, let it settle, and then reached for her notebook. Not the one filled with filings and testimony, but the small one she kept for herself. The one with no lines, just soft, thick pages that welcomed whatever came through the quiet. She opened to a fresh page and wrote a single sentence. This wasn't about becoming someone. It was about remembering who I've always been. She closed the notebook, slowly set it beside the plaque, and watched the porch light flicker on above her as the breeze picked up just enough to rustle the leaves. No speeches, no more headlines. Just the hum of the world going on, and the steady pulse of truth carried gently but firmly in the heart of someone who had never stopped listening. And for the first time in a long time, she felt the story didn't need to be told again. It had already been lived. It was a quiet Sunday morning, the kind that wrapped itself in stillness and invited reflection without asking for permission. Althea rose early, not from obligation, but from something softer, habit maybe, or the weight of memory stirring just beneath the surface. The sun had only begun its slow climb, casting a warm golden hue across the hardwood floors, as she moved through the house with the silent grace of someone who had long since learned how to carry herself through a world that often made too much noise. The kettle hissed gently in the kitchen, filling the room with the familiar scent of chamomile and citrus peel, and she wrapped both hands around the mug, as if anchoring herself to something real. She stepped out onto the porch, still barefoot, letting the morning air press cool against her skin, the breeze carrying the faint scent of dew-soaked grass and magnolia. The street was mostly empty, just one neighbor walking a slow-moving dog, and the occasional car humming past windows down gospel music drifting faintly from the stereo. It was the first morning in weeks. She had nothing scheduled, no calls to return, no court appearances, no interviews, no hearings, no fire that needed immediate tending. And yet her mind did not rest. It never really had. She thought about the letters still waiting on her desk, about the handwritten note from a woman in Mississippi who said she hadn't spoken in court since 1979, and about the voicemail from an elderly man who called just to say, "You reminded me of my daughter." She thought about the mural still standing across from the courthouse, and the young girl who came back every weekend to repaint the edges, one layer at a time, like the act of remembering could be applied with a brush. Her thoughts wandered next to Mallory, not with rage, not with bitterness, but with a complicated sort of quiet. The trial had been weeks ago, the sentence delivered, the papers filed, but the impact hadn't left her. Not because she wanted it to linger, but because it simply did. Trauma, she had come to learn, didn't always arrive with drama. Sometimes it just sat next to you in the silence, whispering questions in moments of peace. She sat down in the old wooden rocker by the window, the chair creaking gently beneath her, as the rhythm of movement soothed something in her spine. She watched the trees sway their branches thick with early spring leaves, and let her eyes rest on the patterns the shadows made on the ground, soft, fragmented, but beautiful in their own way. This was the part of the story no one asked about what came after. Not the sentencing, not the coverage, not the speeches or awards, but the long, slow work of integrating what had happened into the body you had to keep living in. Isaiah had once asked her over coffee and rain tapping the windows, "Do you ever feel like you're still waiting for the next hit?" She'd looked at him for a long time before answering. "No," she said quietly, "but I've never stopped listening for footsteps." This morning, though, there were no footsteps, no calls, no questions, just her and the wind, the porch, the cup cooling in her hands, and the sound of the world turning without asking for her direction. She closed her eyes for a moment and thought about what it meant to heal, not to forget, not to move on, but to take something sharp and carry it until it softened. To be reminded of pain without being ruled by it. The door creaked open behind her, and Clara stepped outside, holding a paper bag in one hand and her purse in the other. "I brought biscuits," she said, her voice low but bright. "Figured you hadn't eaten." Althea smiled without opening her eyes. "You figured right." They sat together in silence for a while, the kind of silence that didn't need to be filled. Clara unpacked the biscuits onto a small plate between them and poured 2 mugs of coffee from her thermos like it was church, and this porch was their sanctuary. "You look tired," she said gently, no judgment in her tone, just observation. "I am," Althea replied, "but it's the kind of tired that means something, that reminds you what you survived." Clara nodded and took a sip of coffee, watching a red bird flit between the trees. "People don't understand," she said after a while, "that surviving justice is a lot harder than surviving injustice. Injustice gives you something to fight, but justice makes you sit with what you fought through." Althea turned her head toward her and met her eyes. "You think it ever stops feeling like a battle?" Clara didn't answer immediately. She chewed slowly, wiped her fingers on a napkin and leaned back in her chair. "I think the battle stops being about proving it happened, and starts being about choosing how you live after." The words landed like truth, not heavy, not sharp, just final in the way truth always is. They sat together until the sun had climbed past the roof line, until the biscuits were gone, and the shadows on the porch had shifted into new shapes. Althea leaned her head back against the frame of the chair, eyes half closed, letting the warmth touch her face. She thought about how much had changed and how much hadn't, about the systems still being held together by silence, and the voices now rising from the cracks, about all the people who had been watching and waiting for someone to stay standing after the lights went off. And in that moment, without ceremony or grand conclusion, she found herself smiling, not because it was over, not because she had won, but because she was still here, still breathing, still believing, still rocking in her chair as the wind danced through the trees, still choosing, and that she knew was the most radical thing of all. There are moments in life that don't need applause or spotlights to be remembered, just one person standing firm in the storm with calm and dignity. Judge Althea Monroe's story isn't just about justice or the courtroom. It's a reminder that sometimes the greatest strength isn't in fighting back immediately, but in standing still, listening deeply, and choosing to act with a steady heart. For those who've lived through the years, who've witnessed right and wrong in silence, speaking up, even with just a glance, a nod, or a quiet act of courage, can be the beginning of real change. Life doesn't always hand us fairness, but we always have the power to hold on to our dignity. And sometimes just sitting on that same old wooden chair, hands wrapped around a cup of tea, eyes gazing out from the porch with a heart that still believes in what's right, that alone is a quiet, noble victory. If this story touched your heart, if you believe that resilience and dignity are timeless values, go ahead and hit like, subscribe, and share this video with someone you care about. Every follow is a reminder that justice, even when quiet, still has those who are watching and standing guard. Thank you for listening.